Approaches in psychology, origins of psychology. For this, you need to be aware of Wundt, introspection, and the emergence of psychology as a science. So the origins of psychology began with Wilhelm Wundt, and he is sometimes referred to as the founder or the father of psychology because he established the first psychology lab, and that was located in Germany, and he founded it in 1879. He developed the idea of introspection. Now, introspection was the first systematic and experimental attempt to study human thought processes. Now, it broke down consciousness into thoughts, feelings, and sensations. So participants were asked to report on their mental thought processes in response to a stimulus. So, for example, a ticking metronome. Now, these were recorded in control conditions, and he advocated the use of standardized procedures. So participants were given the same task, they were given the same instructions, and this allowed for replication of tasks and research. So he was particularly influential because he was the first person to move away from philosophical origins and started to see psychology as more of a scientific way of studying human behaviour, and the idea that we should use empiricism to gain knowledge about why humans do things. Now, if we were to evaluate Wundt, so there are strengths. So his methods were scientific because he used controlled and standardized procedures. So all participants received the same information and they were tested in the same way. Therefore, that increases reliability, and the controlled setting increases internal validity. He was the founder for later scientific approaches, so it led to the development of behavioural cognitive approaches and more recently the biological approach. However, the data was still subjective and he was quite naive in his attempt. So participants had to report on their own thoughts and feelings. Therefore, it isn't objective, it isn't factual, it isn't scientific. It is still subjective in that nature. So you could get some questions like this. Describe Wundt's role in the development of psychology. So you talk about how he was the father of psychology, he moved away from the philosophical roots and started to establish psychology as more of a scientific discipline. He set up the first psychology lab in Germany in 1879. He developed the idea of introspection for studying human behaviour and mental processes. Introspection broke down human thought processes into thoughts, feelings, sensations, and participants were asked to report on those. And it was a systematic and experimental way of assessing human thought processes. And he was quite influential because it led the way for future scientific disciplines such as the cognitive approach, which would study mental processes. You could also explain what is meant by introspection for 3 marks, and you talk about how that is a systematic way of breaking down human behaviour and how thought processes are broken down into sensations, emotions, feelings, sensations, and participants are asked to report on those in response to a stimulus. So moving on to the emergence of psychology as a science. So as I said, in the 1870s we had Wundt with his idea of introspection. Then you had Sigmund Freud, but we're mainly going to focus on behavioural, cognitive and biological approaches. So in the 1900s to about 1930s, behaviourists were particularly leading the way and dominated psychology. So they rejected introspection and said it was too vague and you couldn't measure human behaviour in that way. They wanted to focus on observable behaviour that could be measured. So they advocated the use of lab experiments, so the controlled setting, and as they believed that learning was the same for all species, they used a lot of non-human animals in their studies, so for example rats, pigeons and dogs. So behaviourists were about 1900s to 1930s. In the 1950s, the cognitive approach began to develop. Now, they believed that mental processes should be studied in lab conditions, and they had to make inferences about those mental processes. So obviously you can see the mental processes that were going on, so they had to make inferences about what experiments and research findings suggest about the mental processes. They compared the mind to a computer, and the cognitive neuroscience begins to emerge. So using technology to find out which parts of the brain are responsible for certain behaviours. Then we move to the 1990s, and the biological approach is becoming more and more popular. So they make use of advances in technology. So for example, fMRIs, EEGs, ERPs, and the development in genetic research to start being very objective and scientific in their approach. The biological approach believes that everything that is psychological has a biological basis. So as you can see, we move from introspection, which is quite naive in its scientific approach. Then we move into the behaviourists that believes that you should really measure and observe behaviour and using lab experiments. Then into the cognitive approach, which is beginning to use technology to assess which parts of the brain are responsible for certain behaviours, and advocating the use of very controlled environments and lab conditions. Then through to the 1990s, where we are very scientific in the biological approach. So psychology is becoming more scientific as it has progressed through time. Now, if we were to move on to evaluation, is psychology a science or is it not? So behavioural, cognitive and biological approaches are very scientific in their methods. They use lab studies, very controlled environments, standardised procedures, and that has helped to establish psychology as a scientific discipline. However, the humanistic approach and psychodynamic approach are less scientific. In fact, the humanistic approach rejects the scientific method and doesn't take a non-methetic approach at all. So it completely disregards the idea that you should create general laws about human behaviour, and Maslow argues that you should study humans as unique beings and not create general laws that apply to everyone. Again, the psychodynamic approach doesn't really takes more of an idiographic approach in that it uses small sample sizes and the case study method. And again, the interpretation of data from case studies can be subjective and is prone to biases. So these approaches are less scientific. Also, some people argue that human thought processes and cognition might not actually be possible to study scientifically and therefore shouldn't really be studied in that way. So moving on to a type of question that you might get that might have some evaluation in there. So you might have briefly discussed the emergence of psychology as a science, 8 marks. Now it's unlikely that you'd get a 16 marker in this area. I would probably suggest that it might be an 8 marker. So remember, 3 marks is your AO1, so a third of your essay should be AO1. So how has psychology emerged as a science? So how has it gone from introspection with Wundt through to the behavioural approach, through to the cognitive, and now the biological approach? Then whether psychology is scientific or not. So those 3 evaluation points there, trying to bring in your issues and debates. So for example, you can talk about the idiographic and non-methetic approach within the humanistic and psychodynamic viewpoint of whether human behaviour should be normothetic or we should take an idiographic approach.